Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely fascinating tension that's unfolding right in front of us in modern society. On one hand, we're witnessing this totally unprecedented normalization and legalization of marijuana pretty much all over the globe. It's viewed super casually, it's celebrated in pop culture, and obviously it's increasingly accessible. But on the other hand, when we actually take a rigorous look at the clinical data, it reveals a much more complex and honestly sometimes startling reality. So we're going to unpack the whole shebang, the science, the sociology, and the really tough systemic healthcare challenges surrounding modern cannabis use, pulling directly from leading medical and psychiatric research. Let's get into it.
To really grasp where we are right now, we have to look at two massive trends that are basically colliding. First off, among young people, the perceived risk of using marijuana has absolutely plummeted. It's simply not seen as dangerous anymore by a lot of youth. But in total contrast to that, the clinical reality is that the actual potency of THC, which is, the primary psychoactive ingredient in cannabis, has skyrocketed since the 1980s. We are quite literally not talking about the same substance that existed a few decades ago. It's a whole different ballgame.
So here is our roadmap for today's explainer. 1. The shifting marijuana landscape. 2. Brain development and risks. 3. The psychosis connection. 4. Navigating early psychosis. And finally, number 5, systemic barriers to treatment.
All right, Section 1, the shifting marijuana landscape, and what happens when public perception diverges from clinical reality.
When we look at historical data tracking 12th graders, it reveals this absolutely perfect inverse correlation. Basically, whenever the perceived risk of marijuana drops, actual past-year use among these teenagers steadily and dependably climbs right up. It makes sense, right? As society tells them it's safe, their consumption naturally goes up.
But we really have to ask, what is actually happening to the drug itself while that perceived risk is falling? Well, back in the 1980s, THC potency hovered right around 3%. But by 2012, it had surged all the way up to 12%. And the real-world consequence of that is pretty stark. Between 2004 and 2011, emergency department visits involving marijuana alone saw an astounding 100% increase. Basically, people are consuming a significantly more potent substance today, and our emergency rooms are for sure feeling the impact.
Moving on to Section 2, Brain Development and Risks, where we are uncovering the concrete health impacts.
When we parse out what we actually know with scientific certainty, clinical research gives us two main categories. Under high-confidence adverse effects, we're seeing things like diminished lifetime achievement, motor vehicle accidents, and addiction. And actually, the research shows that 1 in 6 teenagers who start using marijuana will become addicted. 1 in 6. Then, under medium confidence, researchers place risks like abnormal brain development, progression to other drugs, and schizophrenia. These are really serious potential outcomes that absolutely demand our attention.
So why does all of this matter so much? Well, because exposing a developing brain to THC during its active growth window, which, by the way, lasts until about age 21, can lead to impaired neural connectivity. We are literally talking about having fewer nerve fibers in key regions of the brain. It's kind of like trying to rewire a house while it's still being built. It can alter the sensitivity of the brain's reward system, potentially priming it for other drug use later on in life. And studies also associate heavy early use with significant declines in IQ and a much higher risk of dropping out of school entirely.
Which brings us to Section 3, the psychosis connection, linking substance use to severe mental illness. Now, research looking specifically at vulnerable communities, particularly Black youth in the United States, reveals what is really a compounding tragedy. The data shows that individuals experiencing what clinicians call first episode psychosis, or FEP, frequently have this deeply intertwined history. They're dealing with childhood trauma, environmental adversity like neighborhood violence, and co-occurring cannabis use. All these factors basically stack on top of each other, severely worsening the trajectory of their mental health. To really understand the medical system's response to this, we need to define a supercritical metric. It's called the duration of untreated psychosis, or DUP. This is exactly what it sounds like, the crucial time period between the exact moment an individual first experiences delusions or hallucinations and the moment they actually begin receiving psychiatric treatment. In the world of mental health, keeping this duration as short as humanly possible is everything. It's absolutely crucial.
Okay, Section 4, Navigating Early Psychosis and the Unseen Human Cost.
49 to 108 weeks.
Based on research studies, this is the staggering median duration of that early warning period known as the prodromal phase for young patients. Just let that sink in for a second. That is roughly 1 to 2 entire years where early warning symptoms are present, but the individual remains completely untreated. It is a really long, painful gap for everyone involved.
And the pathway to care often plays out like this tragic, almost suspenseful timeline. First, during that prodromal phase, symptoms get misattributed. Second, families hit these massive structural healthcare barriers, which causes huge delays. Third, because of that complete lack of early intervention, a catalytic event or a severe crisis eventually boils over. And finally, the patient enters the medical system, but not through a primary care doctor. They enter through an emergency room or via law enforcement.
The research captures the really painful human element of that very first step. Families aren't just ignoring the problem, they are genuinely struggling to interpret early warning signs. I mean, they see a teenager withdrawing or acting erratically and they think, oh, it's just normal adolescent rebellion, or maybe mild depression, or they're just smoking marijuana. This unintentional misattribution creates absolutely critical delays in seeking specialized psychiatric help.
That leads us into our final section, Section 5, Systemic Barriers to Treatment, Hurdles for Vulnerable Populations. So what are the actual on-the-ground roadblocks here? The research highlights overwhelming systemic barriers that uniquely impact marginalized groups, and this severely prolongs that duration of untreated psychosis we talked about earlier. We're talking about severe financial stress, a lack of health insurance, super inflexible clinic appointment times that completely conflict with working-class jobs, highly inefficient scheduling systems, and, of course, a profound societal stigma surrounding severe mental illness. It's a maze, and it is incredibly difficult to navigate. And because of those barriers, we see this really jarring statistic, 79 to 87%. For the population studied, specifically Black individuals experiencing first-episode psychosis, this is the rate of involuntary hospitalizations. Because they just couldn't access early, voluntary outpatient care, their eventual entry into the mental health system is frequently traumatic, it's involuntary, and it's facilitated by the police or emergency services right in the middle of a major crisis. Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought. As our broader society continues to normalize, legalize, and commercialize increasingly potent cannabis, we really have to ask ourselves, how do we dismantle the systemic healthcare barriers that prevent vulnerable communities from receiving early, equitable care when severe mental health crises actually occur? The data clearly shows us the clinical risks are real, and the human cost of delayed treatment is just immense. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I hope this deep dive into the research leaves you with a much clearer, if definitely more complex understanding of our modern marijuana reality. See you next time.